So we're inviting our speakers up to the front. After such a rich session, we want to also give you the opportunity to ask some questions and help sort through some of the many issues that are here of interest to you. What we'll do is I will take a round of questions and invite the speakers to make notes in terms of which are the relevant points that they'd like to address, just to help us get as many questions in and as many responses as possible in the time that we have left. Derek, Ryan.
Riley, Georgetown University. Thanks very much. I had two questions, I think. First is the definition of food security, global food security that you're using, particularly for the CIRAD and the IFPRI presentation. I understand Tom is mostly focusing on availability and prices, but I wondered about the other two. What are the dimensions of food security that you have included? For Tom, I was intrigued that you've developed this further since last time I heard you, and you're now talking about possibilities of declining world food prices, but that combined with increasing real prices in sub-Saharan Africa. And I wondered what do you have in your model in terms of assumptions about trade and price transmission to be able to get those sorts of results in 2050.
Let's take a few more questions. Maybe right there in front of you.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. I'm a member for UNESCO Task Force, and we are developing ideas how to disseminate best practices. My question is, in your scenario, do you consider what I would call game changers? For instance, totally new technologies for fertilizer, non-chemical fertilizer, which did not require infrastructure and so on. Combined with this is land restoration. I understood that 30% of land destroyed. If we could have technologies to have a radical change, possibly game changer, those technologies, if we have those technologies, well, we could add maybe IT-based, waste-based, information-based technologies to enable further the dissemination of best practices, whether fertilizer or others. How would you integrate in your models these three factors? One, I repeat, is fertilizer technology. The second one, land restoration. And the third, aggregating everything is IT, web-based best practices support dissemination. Thank you.
Okay, to be fair to this side of the room, we'll get this one right here. Yes.
Hello, I'm E. Simmons, Global Panel on Agriculture and Food Systems for Nutrition. And I actually had two questions. One question has to do with what Marie mentioned about taking varieties, diverse varieties into account, and I think David's model had something about lifestyles. But how has your thinking, how has your modeling actually moved beyond sort of food in the aggregate to nutrition in terms of actual consumption? So that's question number one. Question number two is I didn't hear anything about sort of returns to labor. And yet, returns to labor in agriculture are arguably going to have something to do with the rise in income that the simple model has tried to deal with. So how are we to look at, say, the role of agriculture and ag productivity and trade in terms of actually driving income growth? Or is that just an external factor?
I think while the rest of you think about your questions, why don't we go ahead and parse those ones out in whatever order you, Marie, I want to start with some of that.
So the first question was about the definition of food security. We looked at food and nutrition security. Of course, we look more at availability, while in the model, we consider that we have only one population hypothesis of 9.7 billion people. And so we consider that it's a very simple model too. So we consider that what we will produce to feed everybody. But we have these different diets. And in the different diets, we look at now what do people eat in terms of proteins content, in terms of the different fruit, vegetables. I don't know whether you remember in the presentation, we look at what do they eat in terms of root and tubers, fruits and vegetables, cereals, other cereals, and all kind of things. So we really look not only at availability, but also at access and utilization. Utilization in terms what I've just said, and access in terms of how do people have access to income, and that goes with the last question. So that's the definition. One aspect of the FAO definition we haven't looked much is utilization, which is really, how over the year, and that's really difficult to look at in this work. Should I go on? Or do you want to,
Well, what,
okay.
Game changers or in your...
Yeah, what are the game changers? Okay, in the cropping system, in the modeling we've done, there's a link between the GDP, the diets, because and the research and development, because the hypothesis is that people will not in a very conventional world where there's a lot of animal-based food, or there's transition towards ultra-processed products, people will not spend the same type of money on the different crops than they do in a world where there's a diet always which is more regional, or in a diet which is more healthy. So that's the difference we make in the model between the different type of things. The second aspect, in the cropping, we look at two things. We look at the variation in the yield gap. So we have, I don't know if you remember, we have 4 hypotheses in the cropping systems. One hypothesis which we call conventional intensification, a second hypothesis which we called sustainable intensification, a third one which we call agroecology, and the last one which was collapse. Collapse is seen in many regions, and there we consider that there's a real decrease. The one you talked about is more IT-based, or fertilizers, which be more in conventional intensification or sustainable intensification hypothesis. So we looked at this. We do not have the same hypothesis in terms of yield gaps in the 4 hypotheses, and also we don't have the same hypothesis in terms of cropping intensity, because in agroecology, the cropping intensity will be far bigger because there will be more cropping associations than in conventional intensification, where will you have more specialization. So we believe that, as David said, that the research that is done now will get results in about 10 to 20 years from the knowledge we have in our institution, and INRA and CIRAD are both research institutions specializing in these questions, that there might not be really major breaks in science and technology. And believing science and technology will solve all problems prevents from looking at all these different aspects of our systems. And we believe that science and technology is very necessary, but it will not resolve all problems, especially the problems linked to climate change. We've already reached a yield plateau in most countries of the world for many crops, and we see that these plateaus is going to be very difficult to have a major break.
Let me go ahead and respond to 3 of the 6 questions, and that I think are particularly pertinent for our work. First, on Derek's question about this disconnection of national from international prices. So we've postulated, first of all, we had no disconnection. And when we started looking back in history, we just couldn't explain the past. Why would production grow so strongly in Africa with that low productivity growth rate? We had to modify the model when confronted with that. So what we postulated is that there's a distribution of consumers with differential access to international markets. Some have no access, some have a lot of access. Similarly with producers. And that distribution then gives rise to something like economists, modelers would call an Armington structure, which an Armington-like structure, which then permits this difference to occur. So it's kind of the average national price, which is an average of people very remote and those in the urban areas. So that's critical. Something like that's critical for understanding the past. That's the way part of the way we've learned from doing the historical analysis. I wanted to talk about the game changers just because I happened to have a fascinating conversation, like a 4-hour conversation on the way from the hotel to our flights in Marrakesh from the Climate Summit with a fellow whose company works with 100 million hectares of land. It's a French-based company, and they exchange data. And so it's a big IT, big data operation. Only about 7% of them are actually doing precision agriculture with that. So they're, in terms of getting the data in and feeding it back, there's great opportunity, even mostly within Europe. Also, the King of Morocco uses them to refine those. And his estimates of the reduction in inputs that you could achieve with that precision agriculture are truly dramatic. I mean, could be a big source of productivity gains. Let me remind you that it's not just about yields. If you're concerned about food prices, it's about doing more with less. It could be less fertilizer, it could be less labor, it could be less anything. It doesn't have to be just less land. So it's the total factor productivity, the productivity over all factors that's critical for food security. The last one, labor. Really glad you raised that. Let's go back to the 1950s and T.W. Schultz, who wrote an article at that point talking about the declining importance of land in agriculture. It's kind of shocking, especially perhaps for Agromonterra, that's going in the land direction. But it's all about, it's increasingly all about non-land factors. It's the labor, the productivity of the labor, access to capital. Those are economically, in some sense, at the margin, more important than land now. At least the way economists measure inputs. That's a pretty striking, let me put that out there as a fairly striking assertion. And when we did a bit more sophisticated analysis of this uncertainty about future prices, number 2, right after productivity growth, was labor and capital, access to labor and capital. Number 7 was access to land. So that is a very important source of uncertainty in these future scenarios that we're neglecting. We're not spending enough time on that. So I'm really glad you raised that. I think it's critical. I'm referring to critical for future production and prices, but it's also obviously critical for the people who are earning their living in agriculture.
Thank you. Thanks for the question. So in our case, in our scenario, we don't say that we achieve food and nutrition security. So we are not going to have a definition, I will say ex ante, about this is what we need to get there. The model output will give us different indicators that will look at the food and nutrition security, in particular about the food consumption of the average citizen in a country, but also, as I've saw, for a lower decile, so we have a calories consumption. We have also some food diversity index, but food diversity index is something much more complex. So, so we don't use it yet, especially when you move to aggregated consumption, to household consumption, and even within household consumption, what it means. So, but just to say that this model generates different indicators, including calorie consumption per capita, and this is what we are going to look. And it captures both the price of food, the income distribution, and therefore the affordability. And this is why in one of the graphs I was showing, you will see that you have poor household that will perform, but will have lower performance than even the average income. So their relative food security situation may deteriorate compared to the average population. About best practices, in this specific exercise, what we have done is that we have asked the stakeholders to give us what is their vision about yields. And this vision about yields incorporate both technology, climate change, everything. So the model itself is just saying, okay, what is the net technological change we need to duplicate their yield projection? In other exercise, we try to capture the type of thing that you are doing. But here, from my past experience, the critical aspect is what is the accessibility of this technology in terms of distribution among farmers and between countries. Because if we don't have convergence in technology, and if we have this technological revolution, or at least evolution, that can take place, and maybe there will not be yield increasing, but input saving, you will see a fall in basically world price of food, and countries and producers that doesn't have access to this technology will be washed away from markets. That will lead to other problems in terms of their own food security. So the question about this distribution of access to this new technology should be, I think, a key priority for policymakers. About food nutrition, as I've said, we have, I think in this version of the model, 12 different categories of food products, including processed food. And we have changed in diet, but here what we clearly see is if you give more money to people and if you make, as we have seen in the past, significant productivity gains in the livestock industry, people are going to consume more meat. Globally, we will see it. So you will need to change their behavior, okay? So or you tax meat, that's a policy-driven approach, or you do education. But education about food diversity is something quite complex and may take a lot of time too, you know? If we see, for example, for the most advanced economies, the last 40 years, they have consumed more oil, more sugar, more meat, and now they start to think, okay, maybe we should do something better. But just think, honestly. If you look at the pattern, you don't see this major change things. But for most of the emerging economies, they may just follow what we have seen for the developed economies, and they will have an increase of income, and therefore they will achieve some food diversity because they will move from just a bowl of rice to meat and palm oil and this type of diversity. But in terms of nutrition, that's a different story too, you know. So diversity can mean a lot of things. We have not investigated it in detail. Mainly also because I've said, I think that there is a lot of work to do between this large-scale model, macro model, and what happens in a household, and also how income distribution can change your own understanding of food diversity. Labor, that's a critical question, and in my presentation, that's highly related to inequalities, because, yes, we have different scenarios about population. So we are going to bring more people on the planet at a lower speed than before, but still more people. So what will be the human capital of these people? And the human capital of these people will have a direct impact on the inequalities, but also on the rates, on the wages, and therefore on the cost of labor. So in all these scenarios, we have assumption about education that will also change your pattern of production. And just to give you an example, if I take the one world example, so you have a system where you have wealth and income concentrated in an elite population. So it means that the capital at the same time is, the world at the same time is going to become more capitalistic, because the rich people save more than the poor people. So in this world, you will have much more capital, and you will invest it in services, industry, in agriculture. So you'll have oversupply of capital. At the same time, if you have a high level of inequalities, it means that for most of the people, level of education will be low. So you are going to have a scenario where you bring a lot of uneducated people, so wages will be low. Lot of capital, lot of labor with low wage. So it means that you are going to really intensify your production. So your yield are going to increase, okay? And what we have seen in this experiment, for instance, is that the type of yield increase that we should see if we don't constrain the model to duplicate the expectation of the stakeholders will be much higher. But in this exercise, stakeholders have already defined the yield. So here we saw an inconsistency in the storyline they try to build, because they say, we have concentration of wealth. Concentration of wealth means more capital in the global economy, more unskilled labor. So the conclusion that for all sectors will be more intensification, including in agriculture. But they say yield will remain low. This is inconsistent. Something has to adjust. Is it technology? Is it redistribution? Is it riots? But something will need to be adjusted. And that's part of the linkages between qualitative exercise, stakeholders processing, and quantitative models, and in this case with the labor response, the wage response, but that's very eye-opening for some people.
And David, before, what would you say is a game changer? Like what might take you from one box to the other, let's say in your for a scenario?
So
Maybe one or two important game changers.
yeah, so I think that the way that we address inequality within country and between countries is something quite important. And beyond it, it's education and human capital. That really sends you from one box to another, especially if you think that there is a link between human capital and diets. Okay? If more educated people in different aspects of their life also will have consequences in diets. Another important aspect is, do we achieve some waste reduction, or at least do we reduce the amount of inputs by unit of outputs that we really deliver to the human body? That's an important element. And after all these macroeconomic and trade linkages, that's something I have not developed, that's very important, as Tom Ertela said, because it changes the relative competitiveness between economies. Are you going to invest or not? Do you want people to move or not between economies? Because if you don't let the goods move, people will move. So this type of things is quite important.
Okay, so let's have another round of questions. I'm looking to this side just to be fair to both sides of the room. And I know there's a lot to process in terms of, yeah.
Each region. Makes sense to integrate our project in terms of cultural heritage. We did identify information regarding local area, and the Japanese are doing a huge amount of work in this field, including food processing, agricultural practices, and so on. The connection between geography and culture, agriculture, and so on. And I believe we can say confidently there's a source of the economic, social, cultural development to restore those areas sometimes. Is it too far from your models? Would you comment? I would very much appreciate. Thank you.
Like you, Marie.
Yeah. I mean, in the 5 scenarios we had.
Maybe just to see if is there any.
Excuse me.
Okay, why don't you go ahead since there's no other questions for the moment.
Well, yeah, no, that's a very important question. In the 5 scenarios we had, there's one which we call the metropolization scenario, which is kind of the ongoing trend. There are 2 of them which are really integrating the local culture. One is what we call land driven by communities, because we believe and that we see, I mean, there are ongoing trends where people, for example, in Africa, do manage to have some food security and do manage to improve, because at local, very local level, they use their traditional seeds, they have their traditional regional diets, and try to avoid too much imports. And so that's for us a very important scenario and practices. There's another scenario, which is we call the regional, land driven by regionalization, but it's also really based on what is happening at local culture. The thing about the regionalization scenario is that there are a number of regions where today the agronomic people already cultivate land that has a very low agronomic potential. In North Africa, Middle East, China, nearly Asia now, they've already gone beyond that. So one of the danger of this regionalization scenario is that people will have to rely mostly on imports, and that's what you've said. And also, will they have any resources for that? We believe it's going to be very difficult. So that's the danger of this scenario. And that's why, also in the healthy scenario, of course, we have 2 variants, one on agroecology. And agroecology is really also using very much the traditional and local culture and practices, and also the local food and avoiding import. Because really the question is not, I mean, relying only on imports to feed the world. That's not development. That is leading to security, global security problems. And what will happen? There are already today 570 million farmers. What will happen if there's only large specialization, everybody using pretty much the same seeds? And what is going to happen to the 500 million small farmers in the world? Are they going to all go into the cities and eat food coming from other countries? That's a major problem. I mean, we had Argentina just did a scenario, and they call it Argentina. I mean, that means Argentina feeding China. Is that the world that we want to look for? And what is going to happen to the small farmers? And that's really why we really worry about it. And there's a real danger there.
Actually, I had a question. Why don't I inject a question, and I'll get yours after this. To David, when you did your expert scenario assessment of yield projections, did you think about the irrigated rain-fed distinction? I mean, in terms of the sources of where that yield growth would be coming from, whether it's just conversion to irrigation, or is it seed improvement? Or I just had a small question about how they thought about that. And let me take your question, sir.
Thank you. Paul Cadero from the University of Toronto and formerly at the World Bank. I like scenario approaches to things because I think they force everybody to get down to, well, why do you say that and what's your assumption? And I think that the four presentations today have woven this very nicely together. I got hooked, though, on the policy recommendation right at the beginning to get to ecotopia. I'm sitting here listening and thinking, is that new? Like, doesn't everybody say this? Haven't people been saying this for decades? A little different emphasis, new technology, more small farmers, et cetera. But what's new about the policy framework that you propose to get to ecotopia that maybe suggest, like maybe I'm wrong, there's a room full of experts in agriculture here and food security and nutrition, but if you're going to move to a better policy framework, you have to say to the people that are pursuing the wrong one, you know, you need to fix this way you're approaching it. Or you need to do more of this, because if you continue to do it, you're going to end up in 1% world, or you're going to end up in enough food now and eventually it'll run out, and you really don't want to end up there. So you need to tweak what you're doing now, or you need to throw it away and do it differently. So I'm just wondering what am I missing something about the nature of the broad elements of agricultural policy, or is there in fact a way to get to the new agricultural policy that will get to the new global standard for agriculture, food security, and nutrition?
So David, I'll let you start.
Yes, so I will start with the last question about ecotopia. So I'm not advocating about ecotopia. My job is just try to show the trade-off for each scenario, okay? Because at the beginning, yes, when you had the stakeholders involved, people start to get excited about ecotopia. It's like a green paradise. And then people start to realize some implication that was more like a communist paradise, because you will have to say what you are going to eat, how we are going to produce. If you want to have pineapple in winter, it's no, because you don't want to trade. You have a lot of implication. And in the time of demographic projection, it was also, okay, or you do birth control massively, or you have a massive health issue that killed 200 million people in order that we change the slope. So there is implication, you know, in all of this. And same thing when we were talking about the local varieties, the local know-how also. Of course, we can try to foster all this knowledge, and even through globalization, if we see how a crop like quinoa, that is for me a kind of traditional crop, can benefit the global community in terms of nutrition and so on. At the same time, most of this global community are pretty happy to drop their traditional livelihood and move to something else. You know, they prefer to get some chips, potato chips. They are not good from a nutrition point of view, but they're easy to eat and they taste good. So look at kids in in sub-Saharan Africa in many cities, you propose them two dishes, a traditional one and a modern one, they will go for the modern one. And they don't care if it is imported or not. So how you change habits and who has to change habit is an important philosophical and moral question, you know, so we should not limit this. So here as an economist, I say, okay, you have different ideas. There are the trade-offs, there is the prices. If you want to achieve it with trade, you can do it at a lower cost. If you don't want to achieve it with trade, you will have a higher cost, these type of things. So Ecotopia has some good aspects, but also bad aspects. You see, you need to have people taking care of the waste, what they do, their habits, a lot of things. We see that even for modern economies, trying to recycle plastics seems challenging for many people. So changing your food habits in 10 years will be even more challenging. And if you start to tax, because policymakers can implement tax to deal with externalities, in other places of the world, you see that people are not really happy with this. So there is what we can do, and this is how we do it. So policy recommendation are second stage. About the irrigated versus rainfall and so on, once again, for the stakeholders, it was to give us the net impact on yield. So in some countries it can be through more irrigation, in other countries it can be from new seeds. Here our question was not really to define this, but more also to some extent to have qualitative information. Is this yield increase come with an increase in cost of production, more inputs or not? You know, because when we talk about R&D and key innovation, sometimes we will just reduce the cost and therefore price of food will go down. If at the opposite you need more inputs, more fertilizer, more engineers to run an IT system, maybe the cost will go up. So how we frame the innovation and the technical change is quite important, but we didn't enter to this level of details in this exercise.
Okay. Great.
I'll have two questions.
Maybe one. Yeah.
And I already asked.
Sure. Sure. There you go.
My question has to do, Emmy Simmons again, it has to do with your qualitative consultations, because David and Maria both emphasized the engagement of stakeholders in kind of setting out these scenarios. And yet neither of you discussed very explicitly sort of the business perspective. And you talked about the 1%, so obviously you're thinking about capitalism and whatever. But many people are finding that, in fact, what private investors want to invest in pretty much drives how the food system works. And I would just love to hear a little bit more, if you have some comments on what you heard from the private sector actors that you can include it in your stakeholder consultations, and to what extent they might have indicated a different direction than the ones you actually took. Healthy scenario, et cetera.
Maybe just real briefly. Yeah.
So for the moment, the private sector has driven the land use towards metropolization scenario. I mean, it's really, really very much driven by the private sector. Today, half of the research on agriculture is done by the private sector. This research is mostly now being done in Asia. How will the question is for us, how can we drive and show to the private sector that there is business to be done in the healthy, if they go towards a healthy scenario? There are several, first of all, a number of industries have started to understand the limits of growth and that we've reached the limits of resources. And for example, in the car industry now there has been efforts in cars, at least in Europe, maybe less in the USA, but at least to consume less fuel, to be safer, but also less energy, have less emission, greenhouse emission, etc. I think there is a definite interest, possible interest, but for the moment the private sector is not at all going towards that direction. There's a World Economic Forum report that has just been done, and the private sector is trying to show to the private sector that there's business to be done, but I think there's a lot of efforts. One of the major, for me, problem of the private sector is around intellectual property and seeds, because today the private sector is making a lot of the norms around the seeds and preventing seeds diversification, a lot of farmers being able to use their own seeds. And I think we do have a responsibility in saying that and in trying to influence the private sector to change. Because if we continue the way we are, we are really hitting the wall very soon, and it's a general problem of security that is coming. And there's an effort, and I see it requires saying what is happening, and very few people. I don't know whether you've heard of the IPES report that has just been come out on the evolution of food systems. And they've come out, and as soon as they came out, the private sector said, no, you cannot promote that kind of healthy scenarios, agroecology. They immediately, and when we did ISTD, it was the same thing. The private sector came and said, what you are saying is not true, and there's not going to be a danger. And I think we have to convince them, and citizens do have a very big responsibility in that. It's difficult. It is difficult, but it has to be faced.
To follow up on this, first, I think that the involvement of the business sector in this type of stakeholder workshop is already a challenge, and just for economic reason, if you see what is the daily cost of a high-level public servant, a high-level personnel in an NGO, or high-level academic, their parent institution can send them 3 days to a workshop. If you want to have the same high-level people from the business sectors, people will say, no, the cost for our group, is 10, 20 times higher because they have big salary. Also, you have low-level people that are cheap but will not take decision. Or in order to attract the high-level people, you need to have some leverage to convince them it's useful. And if possible, not just the guy in charge of the corporate social program, but more the people developing technology or having to do a financial report to convince people. So having them involved is already a challenge. Although basically, the rate of participation on this category is quite small. So how you attract them is an important point. After, most of them, when you bring them there, their goal is to have happy customers and a sustainable planet, because on the long run, they want to make profits. Now, they are quite skeptical when you don't deal with their concrete technological pathway and things like this. But in particular, in terms of policy, I think that there are two main concerns. One is, it's where policymakers can play a role, not by putting regulation on them, but on making sure that they have this customer that they need, meaning that a middle class, educated enough, and rich enough to buy product of higher quality, but also with more sustainable constraints, If people are poor, they will go for the cheapest food. If people are uneducated, they will go for the cheapest food. And the private sector, you can put all the regulation you want on them, they will produce cheapest food, or they will stop to produce, and it will be worse. So you need to create a market for them. And then they will respond. Same thing in terms of policy uncertainty. If you start to change regulation too often, or if you do specific things on trade in terms of restriction or not, they will be very cautious about this, and they will oppose it if there is not enough readability. Overall, they make investment that will take 10 or 20 years to bring a rate of return for them. So if policymakers change their mind every 7 years, that's not good for them. They don't like it. And they will not invest. And if they don't invest, we will not have innovation for large-scale producer or small-scale producer, because some innovation we see today also benefits small orders. I will just want to conclude on this. We are entering in a phase of low-scale mechanization with drones, with things like this, with precision agriculture that 20 years ago was seen only for the very large and powerful farmers. Now we develop technology that can be implemented at a much lower cost, and that's part of them. And they see that there is a market. And they know that in Africa, maybe it will take 25 or 30 years, but they will have a market. So how we go there and how we show them there is a market with some policy stability is quite important for them.
Okay, well, let me thank the speakers, and I will invite you to come up and talk to them. We'll ask them about the links to their material, the report that Marie did for Agrimonde, the material that Tom Hurtle has on his website, all the models and class material. Actually, there's Georgetown students who might be interested in that, as well as a book that David mentioned and the report. We'll make sure that these are available on the event page so you can go and read all those details about what they did. But let me just invite another round of applause for a great session.